Welcome back to Finweek Money Matters. Banks and funding organizations are desperately seeking new South African entrepreneurs with big ideas that they can bank. Now, many of these organizations are sitting with a number of industry-specific funds. So Finweek takes a look at which segments of the economy are most likely to get funding. We're joined on the desk by Shakeel Meer, Division Executive for Corporate Strategy at the IDC, and then Sean Scott, Senior Investment Officer at Grofin. Thank you both for joining us. Shakeel, let's just start with the IDC right now. You have specific funds, you've earmarked money for specific segments of the economy. Run us through some of the types of funds that you have going right now.
We allocate funds by sector, and we have sector focuses. Some of the big areas we've allocated money for: the green economy, manufacturing. And besides the sectors that we allocate funds for, we try to encourage different sectors of our population to actually get more involved with running a business. So we have funding targeted at, for example, women, youth, disabled, and so on.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, the size, if you look at women-run businesses, how much money is earmarked for that as part of the economy?
In fact, we don't put a limit on that. So we'd be happy to deal with as many women businesses as possible. But what we've done specifically for women, if it's new women entrepreneurs who don't have sufficient capital to start their business, then we've allocated some funds to help them with that portion. Mm-hmm. But there is no limit to the total funding we'd make available.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because this also ties into the previous discussion we were having, is that if you were clever and you were a woman with an idea in South Africa and you were sitting at a job that you didn't enjoy, there's an opportunity for you to create a business and go to the IDC, the likes of the IDC, with your idea.
Sure, it was very interesting. I actually spoke to the Black Management Forum UCT chapter last year, and it was very interesting because in fact 3 corridors down there was the Silicon Cape. We're having one of their networking sessions, and obviously the Silicon Cape is very much a technology focused side of the South African economy. But this BMF presentation was fascinating because there were a lot of very bright kids there. We're talking lawyers, doctors, science students, guys, they've got very big ideas. And one of the things that they were going on about was, and a lot of them were women, young black women, and they were saying they want us, what are their options in terms of getting into companies, and could they start businesses? And it was fascinating when you said, but there are a lot of funds, let's use the IDC as an example, that are sitting with hundreds of millions of rands looking for young South Africans with big ideas, specifically women at the moment. I know it was a big drive for them in the 2012 year, and saying, here's an opportunity, come with some big ideas and let's turn it into a business. But I think it then speaks to this issue of, it's one thing to say there's a pot of money here, but what do you do with a 20-something who's just got a degree? They may be bright, but they don't have the business experience and business savvy to be able to take a chunk of money and turn it into an enterprise. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an interesting challenge at the moment, is kind of creating this ecosystem in South Africa where you can take young women or young South Africans and say, I want to start a manufacturing business, I want to start a technology business. And I think that's the challenge, because in South Africa it's not an issue of where there's money. There's more than enough money in South Africa to start any business you want. It's a case of having the savvy and the infrastructure to be able to make it to deliver.
What do we need to put in place right now? What is being put in place right now to create that infrastructure to close that gap between the funders and the bright young people with potential?
Yeah, I think from Grofin's side, we focus on business support after we've given the money, which I think is imperative, in that once you've got the money, being able to utilize it effectively and create a sustainable business is what you really want to do. So Grofin allocates portfolio managers to each of their clients, and they sit with them on a regular basis and analyze their business, show them what they're doing wrong, upskill them, because that's what you want really. You want the person to be upskilled in that at some point you can walk away and they then successfully take over running their business on their own.
How long typically do you have to hold a new entrepreneur's hand?
Right throughout the loan. There's always going to be factors that crop up throughout the loan period. They may find opportunities that arise, and they turn to us and say, is this something that we should be doing as a business? And we would advise them on that. Mm-hmm. Until such time as they're able to make those decisions confidently on their own.
Yeah, and of course it makes sense for you to protect your investment.
Absolutely, that's the core reason, one of the core reasons why we do it as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's one of the issues that the funders have in South Africa is this, as I say, it's this infrastructure to be able to say to the guys, everyone, when you see the applications for money, they'll say, I want 2 million rand. And you say to somebody, but that's like parking 2 million rand Porsche in your driveway, and you have to actually pay that back. It's not just a case of putting money out there. So I think that's one of the things in South Africa. We still have a very poor startup culture. We have a very poor idea of, we almost get infatuated with this idea of taking money rather than actually building businesses. And I think that as the economy opens up, it'll make it more accessible for entrepreneurs. I mean, I think one of the things that I find interesting at the moment is, what are the industries that are hot? What are the ones that are offering potential for big projects? I mean, we've talked about the green industries, but I know manufacturing is a big focus this year. And maybe from the IDC side, I mean, where are you looking for, if somebody's got a good idea, who do you want coming forward with these business ideas?
Probably the starting point is not necessarily to choose a sector that's growing, but to choose a sector that the person's familiar with. Because starting a business is difficult enough. If you can have expertise, if you've got from previous work experience an area where you know the market, or you've got a network, I think that's the starting point. Some of the industries which seem to have potential at the moment, I mean, you touched on green.
When we say green, and it's kind of a very overarching theme, give us specific ideas within green, because we know there's the big renewable energy projects. That's almost a little bit different to what the IDC would look at, or potentially not. I mean, just break down green for us.
Okay, to start, we would look at the big renewable projects. In fact, we're one of the biggest funders of those, funding both the projects through equity and debt, and the local community shareholdings and so on. But a lot of the opportunities, if you talk for a new entrepreneur, come in green because it's a relatively new area for South Africa. So it can range from installing geysers, efficient solar geysers. It can cover things like alternative ways of generating energy. And we've been looking at some unusual, interesting things lately. For example, using waste from animals and converting that into gas. So there's a lot of raw materials that we've got around the country which are renewable, which we're really not utilizing. So there's opportunities for trying to identify what are some of the gaps, what are some of the local products or natural resources which possibly could be converted to better use. Energy efficiency is particularly important with the increasing price of electricity. And it's not just the services, there could be products which get produced which can help people manage their electricity consumption. So within the green space, there's quite a range.
But how do you evaluate, because this is very new to the South African economy, and then with that comes risk, trial and error. You talk about new options for converting animal waste into energy. What is your kind of risk appetite for new areas like this?
In fact, we have got a substantial risk appetite, because our role is to actually create some of these new industries. But what's important is for the entrepreneur to find ways to manage that risk. So you're totally right. Those risks are in place, but by tying up your sourcing of material, by making sure maybe you partner with someone who's got the expertise in the producing the product, by trying to tie up a market or trying to get as close to that as possible, you start managing the risk at the different levels.
I mean, sure, maybe it's quite a tricky question, but what's a right size investment for a lot of these things? Because I think that one of the problems is, I was kind of making a slapstick comment about the 2 million rand Porsche, but the reality is a lot of bigger businesses, I'm not talking service-based businesses, but a lot of the bigger businesses are quite capital intensive. How do you go and say, well, it's actually going to be a 20 million rand business? How do you get the right people in there to be able to manage a 20 million rand investment, or 50 million or 100 million? Something that's not your entry level entrepreneur.
It's a very important matter that you brought up there. We, from Grofin's side, again, it's all about managing our risk, and the portfolio management team that does get involved are at that level are intensely involved in the business, making sure that the right people are doing the right things, making sure that they are utilizing the capacity properly and producing to the right capacity. It's always important to look at those kind of aspects of business and make sure that you've got the right person, I think ideally we look at the entrepreneur and make sure that they are the correct person to be running this business. And a lot of our emphasis is on sourcing the right entrepreneur.
So you spend a lot of time evaluating them. Give us an idea of when an entrepreneur walks into the room, what you want to see when they're pitching to you.
I want to see that they know exactly what they're talking about. You know, a lot of entrepreneurs get third parties to write up their business plans. And quite frankly, anyone can write up a business plan. It's understanding the business themselves and being passionate and knowledgeable about their subject matter that they're talking about. That's the only way you can ascertain whether they are a true entrepreneur or not, given that anyone can write a business plan and just recite figures and data.
And maybe a question to both of you. I mean, there's the question of skin in the game. I mean, it's very easy for guys to come and say, I want a check of X or Y. But how important is the owner putting in their own capacity, not just skills, but either finances or at least assets to be able to drive it? I mean, I don't know, maybe
Yeah, in fact, it's absolutely critical. You know, I mentioned earlier that for women, we're prepared to support the equity, for example. One of the risks of that is if it's all our equity, they can walk away from the business as a moral hazard. So we would expect any entrepreneur we fund, or any businessman, no matter how large or small the business, to put their own skin in the game. If someone's sitting with that Porsche in the driveway and they say they've got no money to invest, it's something we wouldn't be interested in because we're trusting our money to that entrepreneur. We want them to put their money in their business, maybe not take out much of a salary, be prepared to work 15
So
hour
there
days.
are alternative ways to address that equity issue is saying, okay, well, for a year, I won't take out a salary. There's money in the business, or I only take half the salary. It's not because, I mean, you're not always going to get people with assets to start off with. They might be super bright with a super great idea, and you don't want to turn them away.
Yeah, exactly. Because there needs to be enough equity in the business to make it viable. So we might, if they can't put in sufficient equity, if they put in everything they can, we'd be prepared to consider putting in equity to make the business viable. But they must have the skin in the game so that they've got something to lose. When the creditor comes knocking at the door, they mustn't walk away and say it's IDC's problem. They must find a solution.
What's your approach, Sean?
Yeah, exactly the same. Without any skin in the game, we don't tend to look at businesses. The other aspect that we do look at is IP and sweat equity. You know, in terms of having the concept, having put in all the work and all the expertise and getting it to the point where it's fundable. And that takes a lot of effort and a lot of skill. And we do give them kind of accreditation for that as well.
And barriers to entry, that's always one for entrepreneurs and one that people talk about. I mean, do you look at the barriers to entry, obviously, in the competitive landscape?
No, absolutely. That's part of our due diligence process. We look at how many competitors could potentially come into his industry in the next year and a half. And that obviously gives us a risk appetite in terms of if it's a low barrier to entry and there's lots of potential clients coming on board, maybe that's not a business that we want to fund really, you know, especially if we're taking all the risk. But where there are higher barriers to entry and you've got a good entrepreneur and there are obvious advantages to the business, then we'll take that risk.
What about incentives? I mean, like at the moment, the DTI is pushing the whole electric cars, hybrid car industry. We've seen solar. I mean, there are a lot of where government is trying to encourage people to get into industries. I mean, are there any obvious ones where you've seen the government is specifically, manufacturing might be another one at the moment, are there things where government is specifically driving industries, the development of certain industries in South Africa?
Yeah, in fact, there's a number of them, and in fact, some of them, IDC is partnering with them in terms of implementing. So to start with those, for example, the clothing and textile sector. We know that it's a problematic sector and people have underinvested. So we're working with the DTI on providing incentives for companies to modernize their processes and their equipment. There's the Manufacturing Competitiveness Enhancement Program, which we run a portion, the DTI runs a portion, which is also focusing at growth and development in manufacturing specifically.
Specific sectors within that?
It cuts across a wide range of manufacturing sectors, in fact, most manufacturing sectors. Then there are if you look at, for example, in the green area, through the independent power producer, which is an effective higher price paid for electricity to get green energy into South Africa. So that's a different form, although not a direct subsidy. The motor industry, there's a program in place to support it. So there are a number of these incentives.
And from Grofin's side, do you have specific sectors that you like right now that you're looking at with more focus and energy?
There's no real sectors that we look at because entrepreneurs come from all walks of life and all sectors. We evaluate every deal on its own merits and its own basis.
So, but that being said, I mean, are there any ones that you specifically leaned towards before in the past?
Well, things that are not working too well at the moment are your service type industries, your fast foods, your B&Bs, those type of, where they are, driven by the economy and by people sentiment really. And those are the kind of things you can't quantify when you're doing a proposal on a business and looking at future projections. It's very difficult to ascertain what the level of foot flow into a B&B is going to be in a year and a half's time. So those we tend to try and avoid, but again, we will look at ones that are in existence already. They don't have to be startups. An existing B&B that wants to remodel, for example, where it can show a decent occupancy levels and viability and sustainability, we'll certainly look at that. But it's not to say that we won't look at them, but those are the ones that are not doing very well at the moment.
Yeah.